Good afternoon, children. Today I'm going to read you one of my favourite stories of all time. And our guest today is Dinosaur, because he's not been for a little while, have you? No. You don't want to feel neglected, do you? No. So he's going to sit here with Rabbit and Lamb Chop. Sit nicely now and listen. Don't fall off. Are you comfortable? Yes, he's comfortable. Okay. Then we will begin. Right. Are you sitting comfortably? This is my most favourite storybook of all. And it's called Flat Stanley. So, are you being good? Are you sitting nicely? Then I'll begin. This is a very old book called Flat Stanley. And I used to read it to your mums and dads when they were little. It's about a little boy called Stanley Lamb Chop. You, Lamb Chop. Right. So here we go. There's Stanley. There he is, Stanley Lamb Chop. Breakfast was ready. I will go and wake the boys, Mrs. Lamb Chop said to her husband, George Lamb Chop. Just then their younger son Arthur called from the bedroom he shared with his brother Stanley in their New York home. Hey, come and look. Hey! Mr. and Mrs. Lamb Chop were both very much in favour of politeness and careful speech. Hay is for horses, Arthur, not people, said Mr. Lamb Chop as they entered the room. Try to remember that. Excuse me, Arthur said, but look. He pointed to Stanley's bed. Across it lay the enormous bulletin board that Mr. Lamb Chop had given the boys for Christmas, so they could pin up pictures and messages and maps. It had fallen during the night on top of Stanley. But Stanley was not hurt. In fact, he would have still been sleeping if he had not been woken by his brother's shout. What's going on here? He called out cheerfully from beneath the enormous board. Mr. and Mrs. Lamb Chop hurried to lift it from the bed. Heavens, said Mrs. Lamb Chop. Gosh, said Arthur. Stanley's flat. And there he was, flat as a pancake in his bed. Oh dear. As a pancake, said Mr. Lamb Chop. Darndest thing I've ever seen. Let's all have breakfast, Mrs. Lamb Chop said. Then Stanley and I will go and see Dr. Dan and hear what he has to say. The examination was almost over. How do you feel? Dr. Dan asked. Does it hurt very much? It felt sort of tickly for a while after I got up, Stanley Lamb Chop said, but I feel fine now. Well, that's mostly how it is with these things, said Dr. Dan. There he is with the doctor. We'll just have to keep an eye on this young fellow, he said when he had finished the examination. Sometimes we doctors, despite all our years of training and experience, can only marvel about how little we know. Mrs. Lamb Chop said she thought Stanley's clothes would have to be altered. And so Dr. Dan told his nurse to take Stanley's measurements, and Mrs. Lamb Chop wrote them down. Stanley was 4 feet tall, about a foot wide, and only half an inch thick. When Stanley got used to being flat, he quite enjoyed it. He could go in and out of rooms even when the door was closed, just by lying down and sliding through the crack at the bottom. Yes, sliding through the door. That must be good. Mr. and Mrs. Lamb Chop said it was silly, but they were really quite proud of him. Arthur got jealous and tried to slide under a door, but he just banged his head. Being flat could also be helpful, Stanley found. He was taking a walk with Mrs. Lamb Chop one afternoon when her favourite ring fell from her finger. The ring rolled across the pavement and down between the bars of a grating that covered a dark, deep shaft. Mrs. Lamb Chop began to cry. I have an idea, said Stanley. He took the laces out of his shoes and an extra pair out of his pocket and tied them all together to make a long lace. Then he tied the end of that to the back of his belt and gave the other end to his mother. Lower me, he said, and I will look for the ring. Thank you, Stanley, Mrs. Lamb Chop said. She lowered him between the bars and moved him carefully up and down from side to side so that he could search the whole floor of the shaft. There he is. And there's two policemen. Two policemen came by and stared at Mrs. Lambchop as she stood holding the long lace that ran through the grating. She pretended not to notice them. "What's the matter, lady?" the first policeman asked. "Is your yo-yo stuck?" "I am not playing with a yo-yo," Mrs. Lambchop said sharply. "My son is at the other end of this lace, if you must know." "Humour her, Harry," said the second policeman. "The poor soul's dotty as can be." Just then, down in the shaft, Stanley cried out, "Hooray!" Mrs. Lambchop pulled him up and saw that he had the ring. There. "Good for you, Stanley," she said. Then she turned angrily to the policeman. "Dotty indeed," she said. "Shame." The policeman apologised. "We didn't get it, lady. We have been hasty. We can see that now." "People should think twice before making rude remarks," said Mrs. Lambchop, "and then not make them at all." The policeman realised that was a good rule, and they said they would try to remember it. One day Stanley got a letter from his friend Thomas Anthony Jeffrey, whose family had recently moved to California, which is a long way away. A school holiday was about to begin, and Stanley was invited to spend it with the Jeffreys. "Oh boy," Stanley said, "I would love to go." Mr. Lambchop sighed. "Oh, a ticket to California is very expensive. I shall have to think of some cheaper way." When Mr. Lambchop came home from the office that evening, he brought a large brown paper envelope. "Now then, Stanley," he said, "try this for size." The envelope fitted Stanley very well. There was even room left over, Mrs. Lambchop discovered, for an egg salad sandwich. Look, there he is, getting in the envelope. What a strange thing. With thin bread and a flat case filled with milk, so he'd got something to eat. They had to put a great many stamps on the envelope to pay for both airmail and insurance, but it was much less expensive than a train or aeroplane ticket to California. There they are, putting him in the post. So that's what post boxes look like in America. The next day, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop slid Stanley into his envelope along with the egg salad sandwich and the case full of milk, and mailed him from the box on the corner. The envelope had to be folded to fit through the slot. But Stanley was a limber boy, and inside the box he straightened up again. Mrs. Lambchop was nervous because Stanley had never been away from home before. She rapped on the box. "Can you hear me, dear?" she called. "Are you all right?" Stanley's voice came quite clearly. "I'm fine. Can I eat my sandwich now?" "Wait an hour," she said, "and try not to get overheated, dear." Then she and Mrs. Lambchop cried out goodbye and went home. Stanley had a fine time in California. When the visit was over, the Jeffreys returned him in a beautiful white envelope they had made themselves. It had red and blue markings to show that it was airmail, and Thomas Jeffrey had lettered it valuable and fragile, and this end up on both sides, which was very sensible, wasn't it? Back home, Stanley told his family that he'd been handled so carefully he never felt a single bump. Mr. Lambchop said it proved that jet planes were wonderful, and so was the post office department, and that this was a great age in which to live. Stanley thought so too. Mr. Lambchop had always liked to take the boys off with him on Sunday afternoons to a museum or roller skating in the park. But it was difficult when they were crossing roads or moving about in crowds. Stanley and Arthur would often be jostled from side to side, and Mr. Lambchop worried about speeding taxis or hurrying people that might accidentally knock them down. It was easier after Stanley got flat. Mr. Lambchop discovered that he could roll Stanley up without hurting him at all. He would tie a piece of string round Stanley just to keep him from unrolling, and make a little loop in the string for himself. He could carry him like a parcel and hold on to Arthur with the other hand. Wasn't that handy? Stanley did not mind being carried because he'd never much liked to walk. Arthur didn't like walking either, but he had to, and it made him mad. One Sunday afternoon in the street they met an old college friend of Mr. Lambchop's. "Well, George, I see that you've bought some wallpaper," the man said. "Going to decorate your house, I suppose." "Wallpaper," said Mr. Lambchop. "Oh no, this is my son Stanley." He undid the string and Stanley rolled out. "How do you do?" said Stanley. There he is. Oh, and there he is rolling out. Isn't that funny? Nice to meet you, young fella, the man said. George, that boy is flat. Smart too, said Mr. Lambchop. Stanley is third from the top of his class in school. This is my younger son, Arthur, said Mr. Lambchop, and he will apologise for his rudeness, because he'd said phooey. Arthur could only blush and apologise. Mr. Lambchop rolled Stanley up again, and they set out for home. It rained quite hard while they were on their way. Stanley, of course, hardly got wet at all, just around the edges, but Arthur got soaked. Late that night, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop heard a noise in the living room. They found Arthur lying on the floor near the bookcase. He had piled a great many volumes of the Encyclopaedia Britannica on top of himself. That's a very big book, and lots of them. Put some more on me, Arthur said when he saw them. Don't just stand there, help me. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop sent him back to bed. But the next morning they spoke to Stanley. Arthur can't help being jealous, they said. Be nice to him. You're his big brother. Stanley and Arthur were in the park. But first, here's a picture of Arthur with the books on him. See? Right, Stanley and Arthur were in the park. The day was sunny but windy too. And many older boys were flying beautiful enormous kites with long tails made in all the colours of the rainbow. Arthur sighed. Some day, he said, I will have a big kite, and I will win a kite flying contest and be famous like everyone else. Nobody knows who I am these days. Stanley remembered what his parents said. He went to a boy whose kite was broken and borrowed a large spool of string. You can fly me, Arthur, he said. Come on. He attached a piece of string to himself and gave Arthur the spool to hold. That was kind, wasn't it? He ran lightly across the grass sideways to get up speed, and then he turned to meet the breeze. Up, up, up went Stanley, being a kite. He knew just how to manage on the gusts of wind. He faced full into the wind if he wanted to rise, and let it take him from behind when he wanted to speed. He had only to turn his thin edge to the wind carefully, a little at a time, so that it did not hold him, and then he would slip gracefully downwards towards the earth again. Arthur let out the string, and Stanley soared high above the trees, a beautiful sight in his pale sweater and bright brown trousers against the blue sky. And there he is. And there we must leave him, because this is only halfway through. This beautiful old book that's getting a bit tattered because it's been read so many times. So I will finish now, and we will read the rest tomorrow. So what shall I put in for a bookmark? I wonder. I shall put this beautiful ribbon in so we know where we are tomorrow. Okay. That was very good. Did you enjoy that dinosaur? I think you did. It's a very good story. Say goodbye, Lamb Chop, because you're in that story too. Well, your name is, isn't it? Yes. Right. And Rabbit, you were nearly falling asleep. We can't have that. We have to have you paying attention. Sitting nicely. Say goodbye. Bye. Right. All right, children. I always get that one wrong. No, still not got it right. Maybe tomorrow. Okay, goodbye, children.